This is a video response to Irate Alex on pedophilia. I have the word map in the title instead of pedophilia because I've heard that if you use the latter, that might cause some problems to your channel or to the visibility of your video. Until I hear that it's safe to use the word in titles and that YouTube's algorithm won't fuck you up for that, this is how I proceed. So just be warned, the topic is pedophilia. As a taboo, it makes many people uncomfortable, so I don't blame you if you decide to not watch this any further. But if you want to stick around, I hope you'll find my video at least somewhat informative. As far as I know, Alex has made 2 videos on this topic, and these videos are mainly responses to Amos U. For those who don't know, Amos is notorious for defending child-adult sex here on YouTube. For starters, I want to make something extremely clear. I'm not on Amos' side in the slightest, because he defends something that's simply wrong and harmful. That is sex between adults and children. Kids can't consent to sex, and it's essentially taking a huge risk with someone else's welfare. If you're a pedophile, I'm not judging you for your attraction, as you never chose it. Your situation is unfortunate, but there's a hard fucking line you can't cross. I still want to respond to Alex, because most of his claims about pedophilia are either incorrect or crude to the point that they miss how nuanced the topic is. Besides, on YouTube there seems to be only 2 sides discussing this. On the one hand there's Amos, who defends child-adult sex, and on the other hand there are these people sometimes called antis or anti-pedophiles. For me, an anti is someone who is not just opposed to child molestation. He's against the very attraction to children and thinks pedophiles should remain stigmatized in society. In short, they argue all pedophiles are bad. My problem is that this debate between these 2 extremes gives the impression that they're the only sides, so I just want to chime in and offer a different perspective. Before we start, here are some key terms and what definitions I use for them in my videos. Hopefully this part won't be too boring. I'm only doing this because I know many people have wrong interpretations for the meaning of terms such as pedophile, and that really hurts the conversation. Sexual gender orientation. Which sex a person is mainly sexually attracted to. This is what people typically mean by sexuality or sexual orientation. It's the traditional way of understanding the concept. Sexual age orientation. Which developmental stage a person is mainly sexually attracted to. If you disagree with any of these terms, that's your right, but I'll expand more on these and offer sources, so just please listen to what I have to say. I have 2 examples of sexual age orientation, but you probably should think of this as continuum. Pedophilia. Sexual preference for children aged 12 and under. There are 2 types of pedophilia, exclusive and non-exclusive. Non-exclusive pedophiles are also attracted to adults to an extent. Telephilia. Sexual preference for adults. So this is just a fancy way of saying so-called normal age orientation. The term probably exists because in pedophilia research they have to contrast pedophilia with something, so Ray Plancard coined the term. Don't let it confuse you, it just means sexual preference for adults. Pedophile. An adult person with pedophilia. Telephile. An adult person with telephilia. Pretty obvious. Child molester. An adult who engages in a sexual contact with a minor. While child molesters aren't always technically adults, I didn't want to complicate this definition for what I think is not relevant here. Also, note that minor doesn't mean child, that is, a person aged 12 or under. Minor just means someone below the age of consent. The age of consent varies, but it's usually something along the lines of 15 or 16. Child molesters are divided into 2 groups. Situational child molester. Child molester without a sexual preference for children, basically non-pedophile. If this sounds confusing, don't worry, I'll talk about this very shortly. Preferential child molester. Child molester who prefers children sexually, also called pedophilic child molester. So if a pedophile molests a child, then he or she is classified as this. And finally, pedophilic disorder. Pedophilia which causes marked distress, has been acted on unethically, or makes the pedophile a relevant danger. If these criteria are met, then that pedophile has a pedophilic disorder. This is kind of a tricky concept, I'll probably talk about this in the part 2 video. Okay, let's begin.
And in fact, I do remember Andy Warski on a live stream a couple years ago with Blair White telling his story about his abuse at the hands of abusers, pedophiles.
Well, you don't know this. About half of child molesters are situational offenders, meaning non-pedophiles. This should be well within our grasp by merely knowing what terms pedophile and child molester mean. If an adult has sex with a 14-year-old, while that is considered child molestation in most places, it really doesn't involve pedophilic interest since we talk about a victim who is post-pubescent. What about abuse of younger minors, you might say? Surely those molesters are pedophiles. Yeah, many are, but even that is not always the case, as even sexual crimes against younger children may involve motivations besides pedophilia. Non-pedophilic child molesters are sometimes referred to as situational sex offenders, because it may be a particular circumstance that triggers their offending rather than their sexual orientation. There are different types of situational offenders. For example, some situational offenders lack adequate relationships with adult partners. Consequently, they turn to children to fulfill their unmet emotional needs and, in the process, transgress into sexual activity. Others are hypersexual, opportunistic individuals for whom children are just another sexual outlet. Still others may molest children in times of great emotional distress when their thinking and judgment have become severely distorted and their normal coping skills overwhelmed. If you want to read more about this, check the description box for a link to this paper. There's a classification of different situational offenders on page 6, so it's there if you are interested. To recap, many child molesters are not pedophiles but situational offenders. They offend for various reasons. For example, they could have a fetish to dominate, or they might view children as sexual substitutes in the absence of preferred partners.
Pedophilia, or your minor attracted person, is not a sexuality.
It really depends on what type of a sexuality we have in mind. In the key terms section, I introduced the concepts of sexual gender and age orientation. I haven't made up these, they're from Michael Cito's paper, Is Pedophilia a Sexual Orientation? In that paper, Cito approaches the question by first defining pedophilia and sexual orientation. He then considers features typically associated with sexual orientation in relation to pedophilia to reach his conclusion, which is, and I quote, "By the above definition of sexual orientation, and most common definitions of sexual orientation, pedophilia can be viewed as a sexual age orientation based on the more limited evidence available regarding its age of onset, associations with sexual and romantic behavior, and stability over time." Basically, Cito makes the distinction between sexual gender orientation and age orientation. To help us visualize this, Cito is kind enough to provide an illustration. As you might have guessed, this graph allows us to assign both age and gender orientation to everyone really. Here are a few examples. This is a heterosexual pedophile. Here's a homosexual teleophile. And to end with the more ambiguous one, you could consider this person a bisexual epiphile, that is, someone mainly attracted to adolescents. This goes on to show how arbitrary it is to define sexuality only in terms of what gender someone is attracted to. I mean, we might as well define it based on the preferred developmental stage instead. To claim that pedophilia is not a sexuality because it's not attraction to gender has the exact same structure as arguing homosexuality is not an orientation because it is not attraction to a developmental stage. Of course, this problem goes away with Cito's model, because it treats both kinds of sexual orientation as compatible, meaning you don't have to choose one over the other. And this is great, because I can't help thinking the decision would always be arbitrary. There really is no objective reason why sexual orientation should rest on gender attraction any more than age attraction. Also, there are studies showing pedophilia has a biological component, namely physical brain structure that differs in pedophiles. This is yet another parallel to homosexuality, because likewise we can distinguish gays from straight people by differences in the biological makeup of their brains. To be specific, gays tend to have brains partially resembling those of the opposite sex. This implies two things: that pedophilia is innate and unchangeable, again, just as we would expect from a sexuality. Note that this doesn't mean pedophilia can be treated. Take asthma for example, even though it's a permanent condition likewise. Right treatment may significantly improve the quality of life of those afflicted by it. I mention this because some people, when they learn pedophilia is unchangeable, interpret this so that there's no point in trying to help pedophiles, which of course is fallacious thinking. Just because a condition can't be cured doesn't mean it can't be treated. Maybe you're not convinced, and that's understandable. I would imagine not all researchers necessarily agree with Zita's model, though I haven't come across any relevant academic criticism of it either, which probably tells something, like, for example, that it's not some pedo propaganda but reasonable science. The point to be gleaned here is that whether you agree with what I argued here, at least a number of notable experts believe pedophilia can be viewed as a sexual orientation. And no, just because we recognize the biological component in pedophilia and call it an orientation, doesn't mean that's a slippery slope to ultimately allow child molestation. As an example, virtually no one disagrees that aggression is natural and hardwired to us, yet it's still crime everywhere to violently injure or kill someone.
It is not a part of LGBT. It's disgusting, it's extremely damaging, and it hurts kids.
Calling pedophiles disgusting? Wow, Alex is being really original here. There's probably no need to respond to this, but people find all sorts of things disgusting, such as food items. I'm sure homophobes find gays disgusting. Bigots generally find those they are bigoted against disgusting. While calling someone disgusting is not even close to a real argument, I'm willing to concede that pedophilia is a problematic trait. It clearly makes life more complicated, and people generally wouldn't want to be pedophiles. It is harmful only though when it's acted on unethically. There is no victim in fantasy.
The term pedophile, as you know, people treat that term with a lot of hostility in our modern culture. So I think in terms of like making them feel more comfortable about identifying themselves, they use the term MAP, and I think that's completely reasonable.
Sounds more like a Trojan horse to me, to be honest with you. If I'm honest, guys. If I'm honest here, it does sound like a Trojan freaking horse, doesn't it?
This claim is somewhat similar to Shu and Head's argument that people insisting that they are called maps are simply virtue signaling. Namely, they both assume dishonest motives for pedophiles rather categorically, and that of course is their obvious weakness, for the simple reason that you can't read people's minds. Admittedly, if you dislike certain people, you're not inclined to trust what they say. We rarely trust those we perceive as enemies, but just because you have the gut feeling that every pedophile is a liar and untrustworthy is far from proving the case. You know, that they're all dishonest and secretly hope to see child adult sex legalized, or whatever Alex is insinuating here. Here's an analogy. Many of the more extreme xenophobes think that Muslims are collectively trying to take over Europe and destroy the West as we know it. If we point out that they generally denounce such plans and insist they don't want to kill so-called infidels, the far-right extremists just respond in a blink of an eye that those Muslims must be lying. So no matter what people of Islamic faith say, the xenophobes will never trust them, because they've decided beforehand, without any evidence, that they're all the same and involved in some kind of a Trojan horse conspiracy. Sounds familiar? Now, some might take this analogy the wrong way, because it seems I'm comparing Muslims and pedophiles. Hopefully the majority of you are smart enough to appreciate that the crux of the matter is to compare the paranoid reasoning used by the far right and Alex. If there's no Trojan horse conspiracy or any virtue signaling taking place at large scale among pedophiles, how do we explain they want to be called maps or be recognized as a sexual minority? Well, this is what I believe. Some pedophiles are non-offenders and do not appreciate being equated with child molesters. I mean, there probably aren't a bunch of minor attracted people sitting there somewhere thinking how cool it is that everyone thinks they're all rapists. I think they're more like, well, that's a bummer. Personally, I think my theory that people generally want to be treated fairly and as individuals is much more likely than some mysterious conspiracy Alex just made up. And there's more. Even though we can clearly see Alex doesn't have anything called evidence to back up his claim, we can still make sense of it as a potential example of a specific cognitive bias, which I think is especially relevant in the context of pedophiles. Arguably, most people have heard of the halo effect. Halo effect, sometimes called the halo error, is the tendency for positive impressions of a person, company, brand, or product in one area to positively influence one's opinion or feelings in other areas. It is a type of cognitive bias and is the opposite of the horn effect. And now we get to the real thing. The horn effect, closely related to the halo effect, is a form of cognitive bias that causes one's perception of another to be unduly influenced by a single negative trait. An example of the horn effect may be that an observer is more likely to assume a physically unattractive person is morally inferior to an attractive person, despite the lack of relationship between morality and physical appearance. Admittedly, this is just one factor. It's impossible to say how much it accounts for how our society views pedophiles, but it's a factor worth mentioning. For instance, it could explain why people generally see all pedophiles as incapable of self-control. Even when they know a pedophile is not necessarily an offender, they still see him as a ticking time bomb, ever volatile and slave to his impulses, like the cruelest of animals. In the same vein, Alex seems to link pedophilia and dishonesty, even though no study showing such correlation exists. Of course, as long as people are not robots, this bias will always be there. But just being aware of how psychology plays these tricks on us undeniably helps us to base a judgment more on facts and reason rather than prejudice.
Imagine genuinely believing that pedophiles are worthy of defending.
I just did that. Wasn't very hard.
Legal rights in terms of, as long as they aren't and haven't done anything to break the law or, abuse anybody, then fine. At the end of the day, if you've not broken the law, then you shouldn't have to deal with any kind of legal consequences. But if there probably should be a list somewhere that you're put on, though, especially if you're open about this.
I don't know what type of a list Alex has in his mind here, so it's fair to give him the benefit of the doubt and assume he's not referring to something like a public sex offender register. In case he's referring to them, here's some bad news. These registers don't seem to work as intended. This study attempted to discern the effects of the Megan's Law, which essentially is the basis and the beginning for the modern sex offender register in the USA. Basically, the study couldn't find any positive net effects, such as fewer sex crimes or less recidivism. It appears that whatever benefits the Megan's Law brings are overshadowed by its downsides, such as offenders being marginalized from society or being deprived of a safety net. If a public register is ineffective with pedophiles that are criminals, surely it would be even a worse idea for law-abiding ones. For example, consider the deterrence caused by such policy. While a register for sex offenders might deter from committing crime, a register for those with only the attraction to kids would actually deter from seeking help, which means fewer pedophiles would willingly get help and more children would be at risk. This point also applies to non-public registers, although to a lesser extent. It's worth noting that even though a public register for pedophiles probably isn't the way to go, not all registers are bad. For instance, it's necessary to have a system that prevents convicted sex offenders from working with kids. But when it comes to pedophiles endeavoring to get help, we should make it easier for them, not harder. And clearly instilling them fear of being registered the moment they come out is not compatible with this goal. The rest of Alex's video is just him rambling on why it's wrong to molest children, so there's no need to respond to that. I do, however, need to make part 2 because Alex just keeps making moronic claims about pedophiles in his part 2 video. Honestly, that video is just so bad. The second half of my response to Alex should be up in about a month, so check that out if you want to hear me address the rest of his arguments. It's quite unfortunate he couldn't just stick with arguing against child molestation, which actually is a sensible position. Maybe he thought he could get away with saying anything really about pedophiles, that no one would dare correct him because it's taboo. This is just an impression and I could be wrong, but I'm inclined to believe that's the mindset of many antis on YouTube. It seems some of them are simply cashing in on the fact that pedophiles are kind of a perfect scapegoat. Even the so-called hate speech laws, which some countries have implemented, curiously never seem to apply to speech about pedophiles, no matter how defaming, abusive and untruthful it is. So if you're someone who needs to demonize people with perfect impunity, pedophiles are a good target. I'm someone you could consider a free speech advocate and therefore have always had mixed feelings about these laws restricting expression, and in my opinion there are good arguments for either position. But surely if we decide to implement hate speech laws, they should protect minorities with consistency and not just apply to the ones the defending of which we devote on social media and at the dinner table. Hell, I would even say the more ostracized the minority, the bigger the importance of these laws is for them, but I digress. Now, I'm sure not everyone agrees with what's said in this video, so if you disagree with me, I will block you. Just kidding. If you disagree, you can leave a comment or drop an email. I'm also open to video responses. One of the purposes of this channel is really to just provoke conversation about pedophilia. I think society should address this not only through hysteria over child molesters, but also by recognizing, for example, that there might be a problem with our language if it doesn't allow a term for people attracted to kids. That doesn't mean child sex criminal at the most. But when people are too afraid to speak their minds, and sometimes even to just think about this, there's no progress. So let's start having this debate and make it a real topic, like gay rights or climate change. I tend to believe that whatever affects pedophiles directly is likely to affect children indirectly. So there is more at stake than just pedophiles if we don't figure this out. That's all I have. Thanks for listening.